to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hi, I'm Dana Torts, and welcome to another episode of the Truth in My Days radio program. Today, I'm here with John Torts and Jason Chan as they discuss the important topic of creation and evolution. We are continuing from the previous episode. We hope you enjoy.
Okay, so now we've reached the big question, which is right, creation or evolution? So let's start looking at where the theory of evolution came from. Who came up with the theory of evolution?
To my understanding, it was Charles Darwin.
Yeah, everybody will give credit to Charles Darwin. He certainly wrote that very influential book, The Origin of Species, in 1859, which really did push the thinking of society over into the direction of accepting the theory of evolution. But he was actually not the one who came up with the theory. It has been taught many times. The earliest that we have, first known person to teach the theory of evolution was a fellow called Anaximander of Miletus, way back in 520 BC. Anaximander was an atheist, and so he had to believe that, look, there's life here. It had to have come from somewhere. I don't believe in a God. So it had to have come by natural processes. So he anticipated Darwin by 2,300, 2,400 years. Now, as Christianity came to dominate, these kind of theories pretty much disappeared. But things began to change in the Enlightenment era. This was a period that began in the 17th century. Western Europe was becoming richer, making scientific advancements. Life was becoming more comfortable and easier. And so it began by this Enlightenment period. The roots actually went before the 17th century, but it really took off in the 17th century and then was fully realized in the 18th century when we had the Industrial Revolution. This is the point where people, and this shouldn't surprise us if we know the Bible, people decided to get rid of God. They saw reason and rationality as the ultimate means to attain truth. All truth is accessible to the human mind. He is the measure of all things. He figures everything out. And naturally, then, this was characterized by a full-blown assault on God and his revelation. Psalm 14:1 says, the fool has said in his heart, there's no God. Romans 1:18 and 28 speaks of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness and says they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. They didn't like it. So this was an era where you had the intellectuals, the intelligentsia, the philosophers, the philosophers, and so on, the opinion makers really pushing to get rid of God. It was not something that really trickled down to the masses initially, but it was being pushed by the intellectuals. Here's a comment from Professor Edward J. Larson, then of the University of Georgia. Larson is probably the world's leading expert in the history of the theory of evolution. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author on the topic. And in his lecture series called The Theory of Evolution, A History of Controversy, he says this: during the Enlightenment, during, say, the 1700s, notions of evolution began creeping back in. That is, creation by natural law. If a people are intent in pushing out God or rejecting divine causation, really the only alternative is where species, well, they could be eternal, as Aristotle said, or they had to come from other species. Where else could they come from? Now, I find this very interesting because here's this world-leading expert on the history of the theory of evolution admitting that the real driving force for accepting evolution and rejecting creation was not science. It was the people intent in pushing out God. That was always what was behind the theory of evolution. It was never about actual science. Science became a pretext after the fact. Richard Dawkins, in his famous book, The Blind Watchmaker, writes this: an atheist before Darwin could have said, following Hume, I have no explanation for complex biological design. All I know is that God isn't a good explanation, so we must wait and hope that somebody comes up with a better one, unquote. I can't help feeling that such a position, though logically sound, would have left one feeling pretty unsatisfied And that although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. That's what Dawkins tells us. And here again, you see evolution was there for a purpose. It was to buttress atheism. If I'm an atheist, I have no good explanation for the world, where it came from, where life came from. All I can say is, well, God isn't a good explanation. Now, I don't explain why God isn't a good explanation, because in fact, God is a perfect explanation and it is the correct explanation. But I've rejected God. I need an explanation. And along comes Darwinism, and I will hold on to that because it makes it possible for me to be intellectually fulfilled as an atheist, because now I have an alternate view, an alternate explanation for the world. Whether it's viable or not, I'm not going to think too much about that, because the alternative is creationism. And I'm not going to accept that. So how did the theory of evolution develop? It's interesting that Darwin was not the first one to push these. Anaximander of Miletus way back in 520 BC. But then when you get into the Enlightenment period, quite a number of scholars began to push this view. A fellow called Charles de Secondat Montesquieu lived from 1689 to 1755, wrote, "In the beginning, there were very few kinds of species, and the number has multiplied since by natural means." The Comte de Buffon, 1707 to 1788, taught that all animals had a common ancestor, including apes and men. Denis Diderot, 1713, 1784, famous for saying when he was asked about God, he said, "I have no need of that hypothesis." Diderot taught that all animals evolved from one original organism that gave rise to all others by natural selection. People will tell you that Darwin's genius was coming up with this idea of natural selection, but no, Diderot taught it long before Darwin. Then we have Erasmus Darwin, who was Charles's grandfather, 1731 to 1802. He taught evolution based on natural selection. We have Lamarck, 1744 to 1829. He taught constant spontaneous generation. In other words, life just keeps popping up out of non-life. And he taught evolution based on passing on acquired traits. Now, what's interesting here, do you know something interesting here, Jason?
Everything's already there.
Everything is already there. Everything that was in Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, was already taught by other people before Darwin did. And here's the question then, why was it not accepted then? Because there was no evidence for it. These people had these theories, these ideas, they gave no evidence, and so people rejected it. So what changed when Darwin published his book in 1859? He has not said anything that was not said before by other scholars. And he did not offer evidence. The ideas were rejected previously for lack of evidence. Now Charles presents them and he hasn't given evidence. And yet now it's accepted.
Interesting.
Yes. And why is that? Because they've reached that tipping point. This influence, this desire to get rid of God, which has been pushing ever since the start of the Enlightenment, which was supported by historical criticism, in other words, supposedly scholarly attacks on reliability of the Bible. Society was ready now to get rid of God.
So there's definitely some confirmation bias.
Oh, definitely. Darwin was telling people what they wanted to hear at this point, and that's why they accepted it. Why else otherwise? If it's been rejected before for lack of evidence, now it's accepted without new evidence. Why? Unless it's because it's telling people what they want to hear. So that's the background to the theory of evolution, where it came from, how it came about. And I've made the point, it might be provocative, that it's not really based on science. And so now we're going to get into your area of expertise, Jason, since you're an engineer, which means you know science. Would you say an engineer is better at science than a pure scientist, or not as good?
I would say that we would be just as good. We understand the scientific method, we perform experiments, analyze results.
Good answer, but I would say that the engineer is much better.
Why is that?
Because engineers deal in real life. We can't afford to play games with science. If I pretend, for example, that the second law of thermodynamics only applies to closed systems, the first chemical reactor I design will blow up. We can't play with that. We're doing it in the real world. We're applying it. The scientist can say whatever he wants because he doesn't have a real world consequence for that. So I would actually say that comparing an engineer to a pure scientist is like comparing a Navy SEAL to a G.I. Joe action figure. So let's understand, you have the scientific expertise, we have it, so let's look at the science. And the reason theory of evolution gets away, particularly in schools, is because people don't understand what science actually is. Even a lot of science teachers, you ask for a working definition of science, they can't give you a good one. How would you define science?
So the scientific method, it consists of repeated observations, and it consists of an analysis of those observations, the data from it. And based on that, we aim to expand our understanding about the operation of the universe through the discovery of laws and development of theories.
Yeah, exactly. It's the systematic accumulation of knowledge by the scientific method. And the keys to the scientific method, understand, is observation. Whether you are studying the stars through a telescope, whether you're mixing chemicals in a test tube, you're observing phenomena, and you're looking for patterns. You're looking for things that always happen or things that never happen. For example, I pick up a pen and I drop it. Well, it fell, right? If I do it the second time, it will fall. I do it a third time, it will fall. If I do it 1,000,000 times, it falls 1,000,000 times. Can I prove that it will fall the 1,000,001st time? Can I prove that?
I don't think you can prove it, but based on your previous observations, you can assume that it will.
Exactly. See, told you, engineers are better. Yes, I cannot absolutely prove that it will fall the 1,000,001st time, but I can drop it and it will fall. But then I can't prove that it will fall the 1,000,002nd time. But I'm sure it will. And all of science works like that. We observe. We look for things that always happen in the same way under the same circumstances. And when we see that and we've made enough observations to be sure that it will always happen that way, it becomes a law. That's how we get the law of gravity. It uses what's called inductive logic. In deductive, you can be absolutely sure. Inductive is where you look at observation after observation after observation. George likes hockey, Dan likes hockey, Tim likes hockey, Steve likes hockey, Jason likes hockey, James likes hockey. You look at 100,000 boys that all like hockey. You don't find one who doesn't. Eventually, you conclude all boys like hockey. And that becomes your law. And it ceases to be the law if you ever find one boy who doesn't. Now, that's the scientific method. You observe. But what does that mean? It means science can only study things that happen over and over again. I need to be able to drop my pen and then drop it again and drop it again, drop it again. I need to be able to mix the same two chemicals in the test tube over and over again. What that means, and this is important to understand, science properly can only deal with a subset of knowledge. It can only deal with ongoing natural processes that are observable, that are repeatable. Anything outside of cannot be dealt with properly by science. And here's the mistake people make. They have absorbed, many of them even without knowing it, a philosophy called logical positivism, which means like unless science can prove it, it can't be considered true.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part tomorrow. Same time and same place. If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.